How do you pronounce your last name? So the German style.
Dear friends and colleagues, at this moment we are opening the last session of this great Congress, to which Ifac, this great family, was steered by its president, Alberto Isidori, who is here, and who have selected a fantastic program committee led by Professor Vitanti, who came up with the initiative to have a historic session the way it is now. We're very grateful to him for that. A few years ago, Ifac celebrated the 50th anniversary of its birth, on which it was decided to have a first Ifac Congress in Moscow, the capital of the Soviet Union, which existed at that time, and to have it in 1960. Today, we have an outstanding election, outstanding personalities who will share with us their remembrances and recollections about this first Congress. These are Professor Rudolf Kalman. I don't think I have to introduce him because all of you, your students, your families, your children, I think everyone of them know who is Professor Kalman. So Professor Kalman is here and he will share with us. And we have here two past presidents of Ifac. First of all, this is a unique person, Professor Manfred Thoma, who has attended all the 18 congresses of Ifac. Maybe the only one, at least, exceptional, is Manfred, please. And we have here the past president of Ifac who had steered Ifac to the famous Ifac Congress in Budapest. This is Professor Tibor Vamos. And we have the past president of Ifac who had steered Ifac to the Great Congress in San Francisco. This is Professor Steve Kahn. We will also have a video from a distinguished professor in London who is above 90 years old and unfortunately couldn't come. But Professor Vitanti went to London and brought a video with his speech, and he will show it here. Professor Westcott. So the first speaker is Professor Kalman. Please, Rudolf.
Thank you.
Welcome.
Well, first of all, I'd like to thank for your nice invitation to be here. It's very nice to celebrate the 50th anniversary of, almost 51st anniversary of the first Ifac. But I should add that I hope you will also invite me to the 75th anniversary, which I would probably enjoy even more than today. I don't want to mention the hundreds. My participation at the first Congress was not totally without some previous background. For example, I was at the Zeroth Ifac Congress in Heidelberg in 1956, and I had a lot of head start in research, having been at MIT, then at Columbia, then at IBM, and at Rice, and I happened to have gotten my doctorate just at the same time as Sputnik, which was a big event in America, at least from the political and economic point of view. Of course, I don't want to assume that you take my statements at completely face value, so I want to show you some slides which indicate that I did actually attend the first Ifac Congress. This slide shows me, together with Professor Eisenman, and a very big poster in front of the Hotel Ukraina. I think my slide was more better focused than this particular picture, but at least it gives you an idea of what I was modulo 50 years ago. Let's have the next slide. Okay, you can see me sitting in the audience. No, the other one. Oh, this way, yeah. This way. Sorry. You see me in the audience here, and I'm surrounded by members of the Columbia delegation, although I was no longer at Columbia at that time. This is Dr. Robert Bass, who was also at Rice with me at the same time. This is Professor Friedland. This is Professor John Bertram, who unfortunately died about 25 years ago. And this is Professor Philip Sarachik, all of them having had a connection with Columbia. Could we have the next slide? And this is even less visible, but you can see me here, I think, somewhere at this point, which is not a very clear picture, but I was there. And the next slide. This is an invitation to go to the banquet, which was very memorable because it was held in the Kremlin. Well, as I mentioned before, I was not exactly an unprepared young enthusiast when I came to Moscow, and I should say I was well aware of both the importance of my Ifac paper and, of course, also of the work on Kalman filtering, on which I gave a separate lecture in Moscow, not quite in the framework of the Ifac Congress. As regards these papers were preceded by a number of other publications before, and I should mention in retrospect that these were very easy accomplishments in a sense because they depended on simply using more precise mathematics than we were taught in engineering, for example, at MIT. And therefore, from the point of view of having had the right training in engineering and mathematics together, they were not a difficult thing to do. On the other hand, psychologically, there was a problem because during my studies at MIT, the idea of even a linear system was incredibly primitively presented, namely a system where the principle of superposition holds. Principle of superposition is a somewhat ambiguous term that was stolen from quantum mechanics that went back 30 years earlier, and which itself was, as regards the usual presentation, not terribly precisely done. But it was quite obvious that the word linear had to be defined according to mathematics and not according to some second-hand story from physics. So it was a long but easy exercise, for example, to do Kalman filtering because the surrounding knowledge was available, although there were a few people, such as myself, who were exposed to the to the sort of things that were necessary to do the job. So it turned out that I was the only person who did the job, but there would not have been too many other competitors under the circumstances then prevailing. Now, 50 years is a fairly long time, and one should certainly look back and see what the picture looked like at that point as regards the future, and now, since the future has arrived, say something about what the final developments were that were started, for example, by myself at the time of the first Ifac Congress. I want to talk about which are very fundamental. The first thing is identification. I'm not going to write anymore on the blackboard, but I just wanted to record these two things. After and somewhat before also of the Ifac Congress, a great deal of work was done on fancy methods of optimization, and it became linear, nonlinear, and it became soon quite clear that while the problem was, from a purely mathematical point of view, quite readily treated and to a large extent completely solved, the solution and its applicability depended very much on the question as to whether the so-called model or the plant or the system to be investigated and controlled was accurately represented by the available data. And this, of course, is the problem of identification. Now, there was also, there's been quite a bit of work done also on identification, but there are several difficulties from the scientific point of view that I'd like to quickly mention. As a practical method, most of the identification ideas were simply assuming some sort of a model for the system, usually linear, and then trying to fit the dynamic properties of the model to the available data, the fitting process being some kind of a variation on something like least squares. This was pretty much the standard procedure taken over from statistics, but it involved several serious misunderstandings. The first misunderstanding was mentioned in a brief note by the most enthusiastic professor I had at MIT, Ernie Gilliman, who in '58 published a short note saying, "What is nature's error criterion?" This issue was debated at the time, but unfortunately he and many others did not reach the final conclusion, namely that nature does not have an error criterion. This means that all such identification methods had a certain arbitrariness in them, which may or may not be serious, but it affected the deeper scientific look at the problem itself. The other difficulty was that statisticians like to assume stochastic systems in which the basic system itself was not deterministic, but subject to variations. This is not an unreasonable problem, but in most engineering applications, for example, those which had to do with Kalman filtering around that time, there was no question about the system being stochastic. It was something like, for example, a missile. There's nothing stochastic about the missile, but it has unknown parameters, unknown properties. What was involved in identification was uncertainty in the data due to noise. And the standard statistical methodology does not really come to grips with this particular problem. So in From my point of view, this is one of the basic difficulties in identification, and I actually have done a lot of work on it in the period between 1980 and 1995, most of it still unpublished, but somewhat known. And the conclusion was that in the case of non-dynamic identification, the problem is essentially solved, quite differently than the usual sloppy treatment of so-called least squares method. It doesn't really depend on the least squares method, but it uses ideas from there in a way that it represents, in my opinion, considerable progress since Gauss first proposed the idea. So that's where the thing stands even today. Basically, identification, the main problem in identification is one of noise, and the problem, the main difficulty is how to treat the noise about which relatively little information is available. Incidentally, noise is defined, from my point of view, as something that cannot be modeled. So there are difficulties in applying a standard methodology. It is especially acute in the area of econometrics, and if you read the newspapers today, some of the nonsense that's being propagated by economists is related to the fact that economic data is considerably but not hopelessly noisy, and the methods of dealing with that are very poor. So various forecasts and statistical data has to be taken with much caution, otherwise you run into artificial effects which are not actually in the data but due to the methods used to treat the data. So the issue of identification in this sense is very much still not completely settled from the scientific point of view. Now, the other fact that came out from the work that was presented already 50 years ago is that the main tool for dealing with the thing is algebra, not analysis or applied mathematics or something like that. In fact, the difficulty in this regard is due to many misunderstandings in engineering education, which somehow decided that the Laplace transform method was a good way of presenting the ideas of Oliver Heaviside, who was one of the genius researchers in electrical engineering, but he was somewhat untutored in the academic mathematics of the time. So the people who claim that they have made, quote, Heaviside calculus or such things rigorous, unquote, have done a certain amount of disservice from the point of view of people who had inadequate historical view of mathematics. This was quite common in the 20s and 30s and up to after the war, but under the influence of, for example, Bourbaki, the issue of mathematics became much clearer, and all the modern ideas in network theory, in system theory, were done dispensing with the cumbersome and inapplicable machinery of Laplace transforms. But there remained various problems of an algebraic type. In fact, network synthesis, I'll write one more thing. Network synthesis is practically the same thing as identification, because the problem is to take external data on the system, in this particular case the behavior of an impedance function of passive electric network and draw conclusions about its structure and element values that may be involved in the situation. And that turns out to be an algebraic problem, which was discussed already in the late 19th century, but never completely adequately settled. That is to say, it impinges on problems that were so discussed, but network synthesis was only started around 1920 and died roughly at the same time of the first Ifac Congress, but then lingered on for maybe 10 more years. But it seems to be decisively dead right now. And all this means that the original attack on network synthesis was in the wrong direction. The mathematical essence of the problem was not properly recognized, and there were all sorts of questions that were left aside. Today, however, there is quite a bit of new research in this direction in all aspects, and we have an interesting fact, namely that if you look at the resultant of the defined by the impedance function, that is to say ratio of two polynomials, that algebraic expression, called the resultant since at least 150 years, gives interesting information about the underlying possible network. The basic information it gives has to do with guessing correctly or incorrectly the degree of the network. We assume that we are dealing with a finite situation, as in all algebraic discussions, and if the resultant is very small, in other words, it's very close to being to having a common factor between numerator and denominator, then we have information of the sort that's not available by least squares methods, namely that probably there is misinformation about because of noise, misinformation about the correct degree of the network. It, however, turns out further that the actual value, not just whether it's near zero of the resultant, also contains a great deal of information concerning the underlying possible network. So the modern view of network synthesis is a different way of approaching the identification problem, which remains basic, and because of these new ideas, one can expect that in the Ifac Congress from 25 years from now, there will be quite a bit of attention being paid to this subject. That's all I can say right now in an informal way, but there's no question at all that many of the problems that were tackled at the time of the first Ifac Congress have basic scientific significance, and they will remain so for the foreseeable future. I should also mention that contrary to the, let us say, crude attention being paid to quantum mechanics in electrical engineering, including network synthesis, in the 30s and 40s, there is also a critique of mathematical physics, because network synthesis dealt with discrete components of a finite number, in fact 3, namely resistors, capacitors, and inductors. Now, quantum mechanics is applied, allegedly all of physics, but if you look at the application to atomic physics, then we also know that an atom has 3 different particles, namely electrons, protons, and neutrons. None of the literature that I'm aware of in the last 75 years or so has taken advantage of this additional knowledge in the analysis of atomic structure. So we have a serious and interesting research problem as to how to incorporate other types of knowledge into a conventional approach to quantum mechanics, which is, roughly speaking, the same thing as linear system theory, roughly. And that brings out the last point I want to make, namely that identification under overly general assumptions, for example, linear system or linear time-varying system and such things, is very difficult to push too far, because the more we know about a system, the more effective various methods of identification would be. Now, physicists know a great deal about atomic structure, but they don't apply it in analyzing the structure using quantum mechanics. It's a very ad hoc method. So this indicates that system theoretic ideas, which were certainly present in the first Moscow Congress, even 50 years later, still have to be fully exploited in other realms of knowledge. So I'm confident that maybe at the 25th and 75th anniversary, there will be more good news to be told about the whole situation. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Professor Kamal, for your most interesting words about your vision of what's what and what should and could be done. Our next speaker is Professor Manfred Thoma.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, it's a pleasure to be here to talk about the Ifac meeting, first Ifac International Congress in Moscow, 1960. What I want to do is a little bit different than Rudy Holman did, which, of course, and I want to show you what happened at the time when we had the first Congress. Now, do I get picture number one? No? No pictures? Still? Yes, I need. That's not the right thing. No. Yes. Okay. Thank you. Let me see. Wait a minute. Losing. No. It's not the right thing. Hey. No. Look, this is the first side. This is automatic control. C'è un attimo. That's it. That's it. Now, ladies and gentlemen, let me mention before my presentation will somewhat earlier than the year 1960. The reason is because to understand this development at that time, and so I started before. This is the first Congress we got here, so that's very fine. And you see something here, this is a badge and a pin. I got it here, but you cannot see it. But you see it up there. Every person can get it, and you see the pin, and you see it all together registered. Well, actually, what happens there, the next one, please. We have here also some, at that time, 1960, we had envelopes. We get envelopes with Ifac. Ifac envelopes with a stamp, Ifac stamp, and things like this. Next, please. Just here. Probably you see a young fellow sitting here. There he is. Look. At that time, I was more pretty than I like me look this year. I was a young man, and I was lucky that my professor took me in 1960 to the first Ifac Congress, and that's the reason why I could attend all the Ifac conferences. The next one, please. This is where our international control, actually, and that was the Hotel Ukraina, and that where we all stayed there. Well, let me go to the history a little bit. Next, please. Oh, your university. I'm sorry. This one here. All right, next one, please. Okay. Also, the science and art of automatic control has its roots in antiquity. It was not until the 1940s that it gained general recognition as of basic science encroaching upon other specializations and was given appropriate consideration in the curricula of most technical universities. Such a development is only possible if newly gained knowledge is made accessible to an increasing circle of interested people. In addition to a university education, this can be accomplished by organizing an international meeting. The first international conference exclusively concerned with automatic and manual control was held from 16 to 21st July 1951 in Granville, in UK, and the organizer was Professor Tustin. It was followed by the Frequency Response Symposium on the 1st and 2nd December 1953 in New York, USA. Rufus Oldenburger was at that the organizer. However, no other international conference was held until 25 to 29 September 1956. In Heidelberg, it's in Germany, Federal Republic of Germany. The Meeting Regelungstechnik moderne Theorie und ihre Verwendbarkeit, which means feedback control modern theories and their usability, was organized by the Joint Automatic Control Committee, a small group of enthusiasts from various countries who recognized the growing significance of the automatic control, the necessity of intensive international cooperations, and this field gathered in Heidelberg, again in Germany, to discuss the possibility of founding an international body. As a result, 30 scientists and engineers from 18 different countries signed a resolution on September 27, 1956 in Heidelberg, proclaiming that their support for the foundation of an international association for automatic control having these following objects. A, the facilitation of the interchange of information in automatic control and the advancement of this field. And B, the organization of the International Congress in Automatic Control. At the same time, signatories of this resolution promised to promote the idea of an international federation in their own country. The next day, a provisional committee was formed to work out the constitution for the planned international federation and to organize the first General Assembly. The committee started its work with great energy, and it was first consultations placed on 25 to 27 April 1975 in Düsseldorf, owing to the great commitment of all its members, and it's particular to the skill of the French German Victor Broida. It has completed this task about in 1 year later. So that's the history is almost finished. On the 2nd December 1957, the first General Assembly convened at the Constitutive meeting in Ifac in Paris. Delegates from 18 countries representing the national organization assembled under the chairmanship of Victor Broida. They voted on the constitution bylaws. They elected the first president of Ifac, Harold Chestnut from USA, and the members of the executive councils, and they appointed the committee chairman. The first General Assembly decided that the secretariat of the Ifac should have its seat in Düsseldorf and appointed G. Rubel as honorary secretary. Rubel served on this capacity for 15 years. Edward Gericke was appointed the treasurer of Ifac, and 2 years later was succeeded by M. Kunu, who became honorary treasurer and served of Ifac on this capacity in 1998. The short period between the declaration of intent and formation of Ifac is particularly remarkable, because Ifac does not provide personal membership, but represents a union of animals which in some of the first 18 countries had to be constituted as alliances of engineering. This enormous success is wholly attributable to the enthusiasm of personal involvement of a number of scientists and engineers who were free from the beginning. Okay, I wanted to tell you what the story was, how long it took that we have had Ifac. Now we come to the conference. The first president of the Ifac conference was Harold Chestnut, an American. Then the second president, Alexander M. Letov, a Russian, who presided over the first international Ifac conference in Moscow from 2706 to 2007, 1960, which was held in Moscow Lomonosov University. The sessions, approximately 102 or 1,200, maybe some more or less, just a discussion. Let's say, okay, some say 1,500, but I heard really 1,002 persons did attend the first Ifac conference. About 500 Russians and 700 foreigners coming from 28 countries, and 290 papers handed in were split in the following three main groups. First, theory. Second, components and instruments. And third, applications. The keynote speech, Human Being and Automation, was presented by V.A. Trapeznikov. He was at that time the chairman over the Institute of Automation and Techniques of the USSR. And let me mention, this institution had 6,000 people working at that time. Today it is called Trapeznikov and so on, because it was a man actually who was not only the president of the institution, but he also had good connection to the government, top government people. Special events. Let me come to the special events. Besides the scientific part, is that what's going along? Yes. Right? No, get on. No, fine, good. No. The first one? Okay. Yes. Special events, is that? Are we special? Besides the scientific part, there were also informal visits. For example, I went to Gorky Square, where the Russians had organized an exhibit
of the top-secret U.S. airplane U-2, which was shot down. What they had on display was pieces of the airplane and some equipment of the American pilot, Francis Gary Powers, who survived. Foreigners, and this is very typical at that time in the Soviet Union at that time, foreigners came near the line. There was a big line. The Russian cops took them to the front. So they did not want that the people from come outside from Russia to stay long and wait long to look at the things. In addition, every conference member have received the following invitation. Now you have seen these already, yes, but it's not Kalman, it's Manfred Thoma this time. But the same, of course, the same thing. You see Manfred Thoma and St. and I give you what the interpretation is. Invitation to Academy of Science of the USSR, the National Science and Technical Committee of the USSR, and the national institutions in the field of automatic control and mechanical engineering in the USSR invite, Manfred Thoma or whoever it is, to the official reception on the occasion of the Ifac World Congress on July 1960 at 16 o'clock. It was at Grand Kremlin Castle, I will show you, and also in the Georgian Saloon. When we entered the castle, the famous military symphony orchestra played at the gallery, which was very impressive, very impressive. The reception was sometime later, we could visit the castle. For example, the chapel, which is normally not accessible to the public, even the Russian colleagues couldn't care, saw it for the first time. Glamorous welcome hosted by Prime Minister Kosygin was an unforgettable experience. So we were it was very well to be there. Synopsis, let me say something. The main benefit of attending the first Ifac meeting was the personal contact you made. It was very important. And very important was, besides, it was a tremendous step for widening the future cooperation between East and West. This was very important, and this, I tell you very frankly, that was it was easy, but it was very nice. Well, we could take the next, please. No. A red square. Synopsis next. Yeah. Now look at why do I show you this? If you look at these places, you see two things. Oh, it was here. We had this invitation, and here. And this is the entrance to the Kremlin, here. This is the famous St. Basil's Cathedral, this here. So this one, and this is the wall. So this is the wall. So it's the Kremlin wall. What you see here is the mausoleum. This is the mausoleum at the red square. You see here, and why do I show you? Because there is finally a very nice story which I want to tell you. You came to a nice story. Okay, next, please. Yes. At the Kremlin visit, which I mentioned already, did the vice president of the Congress organizing committee, B.N. Naumov, he was a friend of mine, unfortunately passed away, introduced me in the capacity of interpreter to the Prime Minister A.N. Kosygin. We talked together for a while. Finally, I asked him, is there a possibility to visit the mausoleum at the Kremlin wall without to queue up? The normal time at that time waited 4 or 5 hours to get in. So, I can get this. Okay, fine. By the way, okay, Naumov, I finally asked him whether it's possible to visit together with. I asked him, is it possible, look, I mentioned this already, to get, at this time there were every year 5,000 people lining up to get into the. By the way, a year later, Stalin was replaced in the Kremlin wall necropolis outside the wall of Kremlin. Kosygin answered to Naumov. When you are leaving the Kremlin, go to the next outside military guard and tell them that you are coming from an official reception and that I accept that you can take a shortcut. The guard went immediately to an officer and came back with him, and I understood from the officer saying, "Niet," which is no. "Niet," which is no. "Pushalista," which means please. I said, what did it? I asked him, Naumov, what did he say? He said, no. Nobody can give a permission except himself. And I agree. Of course he couldn't not prevent it, but he wanted to show his power, of course he had, at this time. Then the guard came and brought us to the entrance and waited a short moment until the people have left the place. In order to being polite, we stayed just a few minutes inside and walked out of the Kremlin wall side. This was also for Naumov, the first visit. Well, this is just what I wanted to tell you what was happened and what was going on. And then I have something. There's a book, I want to draw your attention to this, of historic control textbooks. Ifac 1956 to 2006, edited by Janos Gertler, giving a review of the first textbooks in automatic control for 20 countries. This is very positive, actually. Well, thank you very much.
Oh, thank you very much for all a collection of such interesting stories. Thank you very much. And the next speaker is Professor Tibor Vamos.
One step lower. Dear colleagues in control science and systems, more than half a century ago, I interviewed those who had been present at the Moscow Congress and are still alive, more passed away than still around, and one of the interviewed died just recently. The reminiscences work according to the transformational mechanisms of the mind. All responses emphasized the atmosphere and less the scientific impressions. I checked the events of the work politics in the annals of the years of this long past. They reflect the same phenomenon of shifting evidence and relevance. You have to think only about the change of the Congress country, the late Soviet Union, or the emergence of China as a decisive power. My paper at the first Ifac Congress in '60 was given about the dynamic performance of coal-fired steam generators, where they are now. My paper at this Congress was dedicated to understanding among human and machine actors. Do you understand me? For us and myself, not accepted, the science of détente, of a milder atmosphere between the West and the East, were the major event, embodied in the very existence of Ifac and its relevance. After the period of the Cold War and the horrors of the Stalinism and the craze of McCarthyism, we felt a promising new atmosphere and a period when science and scientists obtained a new status on both sides as being the promoters and the instruments of promises. Aren't we now? I hope so. Ifac was really a prototype of international organization under détente. It was informally agreed that the two sides should get equal representation in the governing bodies and in organizing meetings. The major and pioneering initiative was the acknowledgement of the two German states at that time when neither of them acknowledged the existence of the other. The prestigious West German VDI took on the running and expenses of the Secretariat, as Manfred told you, with Gerhard Ruppel as honorary secretary. The Soviet government supported this feeling with demonstrative actions. They opened up the travel to Leningrad, now and once more St. Petersburg. Normally, St. Petersburg, not in Florida. Normally, not allowed for foreigners, this travel. Presented in public those scientists who, due to some crazy sense of security, were in secret, closed institutes, sent first-class scientists into the Ifac bodies, and Vice Premier Kosygin, who was also named now, he was considered a progressive personality, played a role at the Congress. The grandeur of the Kremlin and the reception in its historic halls was a well-organized highlight. And everybody whom I interviewed remember that, and that was their first impression and the most strong impression. In the background, there were the Russian bureaucracy, as usual, with traditions reaching back before the Soviet period. The participants, for the officials of the bureaucracy, they were called delegates, had to stand in queue much after midnight for getting their hotel rooms, and the same queue was for the elevators in those pompous high buildings you have seen on the display. The problem of free access to dining outside the places provided by the authorities. Returning to the historical honors, it's instructive to see how the situation fluctuated around this period. East-West negotiations, reasonable proposals of collaboration in using nuclear energy, that started with the Geneva Conference in 1955, and their rejection, great achievements in space technology and the missile crisis, successes of freedom movements in Africa and their dark sides, I'm not speaking of the skin color, political divisions in the Soviet leadership. We, control people, mostly try to see the promises of those times and hoped that all things bad and evil would just go away. The attitude was strongly related to our scientific and technological activity and was deeply rooted in our minds. Let's have reasons for sustaining our optimism. The Congress was a great revelation of a new science, the ability of well-calculated control of technical and other systems, their common principles in controllability and search for reliable controls. The slogan about robust control came later. The original publications of these basic results, shaping further progress still to date, appeared somehow earlier. I refer here to the new foundations of modern control theory by Rudy Kalman, to the renaissance of the Lyapunov view, to the influence of Kolmogorov on stochastic control, and the theory of optimal control by Pontryagin. The papers of the Congress reflected the state of the art, the stimulating effect of the new theoretical views of further research and more technical aspects. It was a great get-together of historical contributors in founding control system education, of developers' control components current at that time, and of engineers speaking about results in application to major industrial technologies. The names were familiar from the literature, but seeing them now in person, enjoying the real-life characters as individuals, meeting the age-shaping elite of the profession was a stimulus itself. We can feel the same just now before this meeting. Automatic control was the focus of these progressive trends. At that time, before the arrival of several newer branches of modern science and technology, it was considered even more relevant than nowadays. The key persons of this phenomenon received a special forum beyond the official Congress program. These were the lectures given by Norbert Wiener and Rudy Kalman. The Congress opened a long sequence of Ifac meetings and scientific view of large-scale systems developing into a fertile instrument of several sciences. I emphasize only the initiative of our first president, Harold Chestnut, the consideration of human aspects in technical systems, and later also in international relations. To talk of this is extremely appropriate here in Italy, one of the most important birthplaces of our universal culture, perhaps the only place where the continuity of this culture has existed during millennia, as you can witness when walking around here at every corner. This tradition should be preserved after our farewell for many more generations to come. Walking in Milan, we see monuments of great personalities of mankind, still living spiritually with us. Of the many, let me refer to three. First, Maria Gaetana Agnesi, an ingenious mathematician working in the 19th century. We visited just yesterday in the academic library her books. She worked in analysis, one of our material sciences. She was the first female university professor in the world history after Hypatia, whose tragedy in the 4th century marked also the final act of antiquity's brilliance. Memento, how reluctant we still are, the other gender in our activities. I was the only male person participating at a woman gender meeting here in this room just 2 days ago. The other remarkable person was her contemporary, Cesare Beccaria. You can see his statue in the Ambrosian Library. He was the first scientist of law fighting against capital punishment, establishing the philosophy of humanistic legal relations, a quest still relevant to all those values which governed the founding fathers of Ifac during the period we are now commemorating. Concluding, I refer to Giorgio Quazza, whom I've met first at the Moscow Congress, who was a friend and an outstanding example for all of us, and whom I considered, paraphrasing Shakespeare, the right Duke of Milano. That was Prospero. He represented all values that are precious for us, the quality of science, attention to practical applications, social responsibility, and humanity. This Congress, closing now, developed these virtues further. An excellent, smooth organization of this Congress put together more people from our sciences as any of previous congresses before, and had a relevant new aspect. This was the Congress of the young generation. PhD students and other starters performed their own achievements, and those who stimulated these were sitting in the background and were listed as one of the authors. This great and that's really an impression for being satisfied that we could disseminate good seeds for the future. Let's hope so.
Thank you very much for sharing with us your wisdom and your vision of life. Thank you. And now the video, please. This is an interview with Professor John Westcott in London, an interview made by Sergio Vitaletti.
We are very glad today to have here Professor John Westcott, a living legend of Ifac and control science.
So when we got to the Thursday at the banquet, an American called Rufus Oldenburger said, we ought to form an international federation. I'll draw up a charter and you all sign it. Well, some people were a little nervous about this, but we thought, well, it's all harmless, so we cheerfully signed. never dreaming what would follow from it. We should have been more respectful, really, because look how it is now. Now, in those days, in the early days of Ifac, if you wanted to be successful, you had to be a gifted linguist. So finally in Paris in 1957, in September, we had a formal constitution for Ifac. And it was agreed that the first president should be an American, Harold Chestnut, the author of the text of the time, Chestnut and Mayer. And the venue would be in Moscow, and under the leadership of Letov. But come the September, we all got there all right, and it was really a splendid occasion. 1,100 delegates, half of them Russian, it's true, but the rest from all over the world. And the preprints, 280 papers, about 3 inches thick, weighing about 5 kilograms. Fortunately, they gave us bags to carry them around, but we had to lug these around for the whole 5 days. And of course, with 10 parallel sessions, it was only possible to do at most a tenth of the... but even with that sort of thing, it was clear that as far as the Russians were concerned, automatic control was a serious subject. The nagging thing that overhung the whole thing was, were these systems going to be economically viable? You know, that early stage, nobody knew. But there was somehow a feeling that the rewards were going to be very great, and whoever got there first would get them. Then after the conference, there came the visits. In Moscow, it's difficult to give a balanced view of the Institute of Automation and Telemechanics, which after all was the premium research scheme in the Soviet Union. And even after sort of a week of learning to not judge things by what they seemed, it still seemed to us remarkable that this was the premium institute. It was, from our point of view, it looked more like a workshop than a research institute. Under Professor Eiserman, there was a laboratory which specialized in hydraulic and pneumatic systems. They took the view that these were more reliable than the electronic ones, and for the time scale that was appropriate for process control, this was the best thing. So that was quite interesting. The other one, which I will mention, is Professor Feldbaum. Had a laboratory which was concerned with extreme wind regulators. He had one which leapt to its optimum in 8 steps. We weren't very impressed by that because there was no dynamics in it. But they waved an arm to some bigger boxes, which they said were suitable for optimizing on 5 variables or 10 variables or even 12 variables. The next visit was Leningrad, City of Light, a recognizably European city. And the people were more relaxed, I think, than in Moscow. The Institute of Electromechanics was concerned for about half of its work on the control of telescope. The director explained to us that the main business was concerned with electric transmission and distribution. And they had a wide selection of automatic devices for this work. They took us into the laboratory where the telescope work was developed, and they said that they did the design, and then when the design was complete, they put it out. They showed us some examples of the work that had been put out, and I must say they had our sympathies. There obviously were problems with that. They said that they specialized in complex automation. So we had to ask them what that was. Well, that meant the automating of complete plants. So we said, well, how did they get their problems? They said, oh, they were provided by the users. And they took us around what they called the demonstration laboratories, where they had, it was like a sales office. They had on show what you could have. And they said that once a user had committed himself to have an installation, then the institute set up in a laboratory in their factory, and the whole thing was organized from that. And they stayed there until it was done.
Thank you for having this interview and this video. Thank you, Sergio. And so our last speaker is Professor Steve Kahn of the United States, who was president before and at San Francisco in the 1990s.
So my task, among other things, is to end by 4 o'clock. And I will see that we do that. I've been adapting as we go along. And the title of what I wanted to talk about was, "And Then We Had Some Other Congresses." I was not in Moscow. I was too young. I know most of you won't believe that, but it's true. And we've now heard a lot about Moscow. So let's talk a little bit about what happened after that. I know that many of you are not as familiar with how Ifac works as many of us in Ifac wish you were, so I'm going to try to help out a little bit. First of all, realize that the Congresses are always in the home country of the presidents. And if you think about that for a while, you'll imagine the complications involved in determining where the next Congress should be. And by next, I mean many, many years ahead. Now, after Moscow, the president was Professor Eduard Guericke from Switzerland. And so the Congress was in Basel, in fact. Before that Congress occurred, Guericke had been instrumental in designing the Ifac logo. It's hard to realize, but Ifac didn't exist even in the minds of anyone until the late 50s. And then all of a sudden it had its first Congress in Moscow, which you heard a lot about. And then it proceeded. And there were a lot of issues that were raised, like should the Congresses and the presidency turn over every 3 years or every 2 years? It was decided to do it every 3 years. So in Basel, where we had about 1,500 attendees and only 159 papers, we had a huge industrial exhibit, which was very attractive to industry. So we had many people who came who probably didn't listen to the papers, but they enjoyed the industrial exhibit. That was followed by London in 1966 with John Coles, who played a very important role in the founding of Ifac and in the development of the publications program for Ifac, which I'll mention briefly as we go along. 1966, 1,800 attendees, 287 papers. The opening ceremony was attended by a couple of fellows that you might know, Prince Philip and Harold Wilson, Prime Minister at that time of Great Britain. And for the first time, the word computer started to creep into some of the papers. Imagine those days when you said computer, you thought of a room full of equipment, or maybe a small room, and a lot of air conditioning. It's another story, but... this was the first time the control community started to think a little bit about the use of computers, but unfortunately, with the size of the machines, they couldn't do very much in practice. Paweł Nowacki from Warsaw, Poland, was the president from 1996 to 1999, and the Warsaw Congress there attracted 300 papers, about twice the number from before, and also attracted my wife, who I met there. So that was a pretty important Congress. Victor Broida from France, a labor union executive, was the president of Ifac in the next triennium, and the next Congress occurred in Paris in 1972 with 1,300 attendees, 216 technical papers. At that time, we were still using simultaneous translation. Now, for most of you in the audience, you've never heard that term before, so ask an older person what that means. But it means big complications for a Congress and really a complex and expensive program. Another thing that happened in France was unique in Ifac's history. Ifac, as you know, has no political outlook, and plays no role in politics. But one of our colleagues, Alexander Lerner, in Moscow, was having some difficulties in his attempts to immigrate. And we had an actual political rally, a small one, walking the halls of the Congress during that meeting. And we didn't know what to do, except to tell them how sorry we were for the situation, but Ifac took no stand on political activities. John Lozier from the United States, from Bell Labs at that time, was president until 1975. 1,350 attendees, 347 papers. And by now, Ifac had grown from those 3 technical committees you saw on the slides earlier to 15. There was something, you'll find out the Americans did it a second time too, but that really helped, and it started to bring more people in to the community. It meant that the congresses tended to be broader based, had a wider range of technologies discussed, and became more attractive. In 1978, the Congress was held in Helsinki, in Finland. Levi Lotto was the president, and right around that time, there was a recognition within Ifac that we needed a publications program. Up to that point, everyone who ran an Ifac meeting, a Congress, or a symposium, found their local uncle or relative who had a printing press and ground out the proceedings in some slightly ill-defined way. And when the Congress was over, nobody knew where they were and how to get copies. And so there were many things, maybe not ultimately lost. The Secretariat has a pretty good collection right now. But it was obvious that we were not serving the community very well, because if you didn't go to the Congress, you couldn't find any reference to these papers or how to get them, except to contact the author, at that time by telephone, maybe by fax, but that was a little advanced at that point. So in 1976, in Udine, just a few miles from here, a couple hundred miles from here, the year of the earthquake, for those of you who remember that, Ifac made an important decision, and that was to sign up a commercial publisher to forever publish the Ifac proceedings of meetings. This was set up an organization to do that, which exists today. And as a matter of fact, I've been on it ever since then, which shows you how old I really am. And this now started to allow us to systematically collect the intellectual work of our contributors and allow people to know where to go to get copies of these books, which were pretty expensive, actually, then and even later on. Professor Sawaragi in Japan was the president of Ifac in 1981. Congress was in Kyoto. There were several serious side trips to China at that time, which was very much off the radar of most people outside the Orient anyway. In Kyoto, there were 600 technical papers. And it was the first Congress in which the Giorgio Quadza Award was given, named after Giorgio Quadza, who you've heard about many times and certainly knew him before we came here. Just from a technical side, Larry Ho and his team started to talk seriously about discrete event dynamic systems at that time. Again, I think putting some of these dates in perspective may be helpful because many of you weren't even born then, but those who were may have forgotten kind of the order of this activity. Okay, after Kyoto, Ifac held its 25th anniversary in the town in which it was formed, namely Heidelberg. That was 1982. It was an exciting event. It's pretty well documented. Tibor Vamush was our president when we went to Budapest in 1984. 1,157 attendees and 544 papers. I'll say more about these numbers in a minute. Manfred Thoma, who incidentally left early because his wife is very ill and he had to get an airplane to get home tonight, who is the only person we believe who has attended all the Ifac congresses. But I'd love to have somebody write me a note and say, no, I did too. But we don't know of any others. There were a handful of us that have attended all but that one. So we were in Munich. Some innovations there. There were 34 survey papers in Munich, which was kind of a new idea. Just like in France, I should have mentioned, there was a notion of a rapporteur system. in which there was someone who had previously read the papers in a session in detail and reported his or her observations about those papers. Turns out that didn't work very well. It was very complicated, and so that wasn't carried forward. But certainly the survey paper idea, carried forward. 1990, Tallinn, Estonia. Boris Tom was our president, deceased now. 1,000 attendees and 600 papers. That was also an interesting time in the life of Estonia. I remember I went there the year before, on May 1st, which normally in that part of the world had been a celebration day of some political sort. On May 1st in 1989, there was nobody on the street at all. Everybody had gone off to their summer houses. The era was changing, and we were a part of that, and it was commented on at the Congress. In Sydney, Australia, 1993, Brian Anderson was president, sitting here. 1,200 attendees, 1,000 papers. And that marks a change that I'll mention in a minute. And this was the first Congress that had really a lot of parallel sessions. I don't remember the number, but there must have been 25 or 30, which has become common in Ifac. But in the old days, when you had so few papers and so many attendees, everybody could go more or less to every paper. Now, you can't get to more than about 1/26 or 1/30th of the papers at any Congress. We were a little worried at that time about no-show authors, and that's been pretty well resolved by requiring that authors, when they submit their paper, pay their registration fee when the paper has been accepted, which is common. Now, this comment about the attendance and papers, if you look at the chart, and I did not prepare a chart for you, I thought you probably looked at enough charts this week, the ratio of attendees to papers was about 5 in the 1960s and 70s. 5 times as many attendees as papers. In the 80s and early 90s, let's say in the 80s, that number was about 2.5. And today, and for the last 20 years or so, it has been essentially 1-to-1. You draw your own conclusions about what that means and whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, but it's something that is, in fact, the case. I think as we look back on where this organization has come from, and it was very interesting to hear from the people who had started it, and in fact who were there to see it, we've come a long way, maybe. We now have 45 or so technical committees. They're very active. There are thousands of people. You will see some statistics at the closing ceremony, I believe, about all of these numbers. But it's a big deal. It's a big group, and I'm always delighted when I come to one of these congresses and don't know many people. That means that there are a whole lot of new faces. And these faces are the ones probably sitting in this room who are going to be leading Ifac in the next decades, and I think we're all looking forward to that. So what about the future? The future of the Congress is dependent by the local NMO that's hosting it. And as you know, it will be in South Africa in 3 years and in Toulouse in 6 years. What is it going to look like? Right now, we hand out CD-ROMs or DVDs. Maybe someday we'll hand out Kindles with a program in it or something equivalent. The price of those are coming down. The price of the Congresses are going up, not very much. This Congress held the line on that. But I think we should be thinking big about how we can improve the experience we all have, no matter how much it costs or how little it costs. It's a great effort for all of us to come to an Ifac Congress. And I think it's incumbent upon us to be sure that we deliver a product that is so attractive that no one ever questions whether they should go to the Triennial Congress. Let's think outside of the box in the future. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Kahn, for your memories and interesting comments. So this is the end of our session. Thank you very much for your attention, and let us wish a great future for our beloved Ifac, its present and future presidents, and all of you in your research, and for your families, relatives, and that there would be a stable situation on our planet, which would allow everyone to live in peace and security and productive work. Thank you.